Um, I'm sure
We do it.
people will trickle in. But welcome everyone. We are at patron Q&A number 11. So this is the 11th one. We hit double digits last time,
Woo!
and this is where we go over specific questions that we get asked through our Discord, through private messages from our patrons about esports health, esports performance, or anything as it relates to their concerns around gaming and gaming well, or gaming at the level that they want to. And today we're going to be answering 3 questions relating to wrist and hand health, as well as some nutrition around uh, tendons and nutrition around potential wound or tissue healing. So it's going to be pretty interesting, and hopefully we can answer in depth, those questions for our patrons. But let's go over to question number 1. And this was a question from, I think, our patron Too Easy, great name, and he asked, a lot of CS:GO pros use really low sensitivity and don't have much issues. Would you say low sense in Fortnite is unhealthy? So he's a Fortnite player, and I think this is a pretty good question. But first, I just want to say that I think a lot of CS:GO pros do have issues despite having lower sensitivity. But as we approach many other questions, it is always a matter of it depends. There's a lot of different factors that we have to consider. So let's break some of this down. Right? This all comes down when we're talking about sensitivity to the distribution of muscles that we utilize, depending on the sensitivity that we choose. So let's just compare higher and lower sensitivity first. Higher sensitivity or higher DPI, or lower sensitivity or lower DPI. When we have higher sense, we have to move less physical distance to cover more virtual or pixel distance. We all know this, of course, vice versa. But that often influences what muscle groups we use when moving the mouse. Right? So if we have higher sense, let's say, I think my friend just told me very recently, he uses 9,000 DPI for an FPS game, for Valorant, okay? And that, to me,
I
that's crazy. I play with
mhm.
500 DPI, but with higher sensitivity, it might require maybe the use of your fingers to move the mouse, or your wrist. And that's more likely than maybe using your arm or maybe using your shoulder when you have that really, really high sensitivity. Um, of course, it just depends on what movement you're used to when you are moving the mouse. If you have high sensitivity, you can absolutely use your elbow, you can absolutely use your shoulder. But I'm saying the majority of people tend to use their fingers or their wrist as a distribution of what muscles they use to actually move the mouse. And I would say, speaking to what game you play, I would say in general, Fortnite does require a little more movement overall per game, or maybe per minute, with box fighting, the terrain within maps, the terrain within POIs that require you to check multiple angles, compared to a game like CS:GO, um, where you can pre-aim a lot of angles when you know the map. And if we talk about the flip side, lower sensitivity requires typically more shoulder and arm movement compared to the wrist, right? Because we have to cover more space, more physical space. So we actually need more overall movement to be able to cover the same virtual or pixel distance. And again, that is not to say that there aren't people that like to use their wrists or even their fingers to control the mouse when they're aiming, right? So the question of whether it's healthy or unhealthy, as you guys can see, it really does depend, right? It depends, one, on how do you move your mouse and how do you aim. Do you prefer using your fingertips? Do you use your wrist or your shoulder more? And then, two, right, what game do you play? Do you play Fortnite? Do you play CS:GO? Do you play Siege? Do you play any other FPS game or other game that you're used to? Right? Different games have different requirements and how far we might need to flick the mouse to move a certain distance within the game, within the physics or the, I guess, 3D environment of the game. Um, but I think the biggest takeaway is that, hey, well, regardless of what sensitivity that you choose, it's going to cause the stress to go somewhere, So I want to give you guys sort of a stepwise pattern on how to approach this because, hey, it doesn't really answer the question. Essentially, I want to give you guys some steps so that you guys know what to do when it comes to choosing sense. So choose a sensitivity one that will allow you to perform well at your game. If there's more angles that you are required to flick to in your game, then consider maybe a higher sense. And of course, that might be up to debate depending on the game. And then two, be aware of what you're using. Are you using your wrists, your fingers, your arm, your shoulders to move the mouse? Whichever one you're using the most, hey, that's where you're going to be putting yourself at higher risk for developing some overload or developing some pain. And then what we can do is actually we can eliminate that risk or reduce that risk by doing what I always reference as the big three, which is optimizing or looking at your posture and ergonomics, taking regular breaks and integrating that into your playing schedule, and then increasing the size of your HP meter or the endurance of your muscles that you're using a lot. So if you use your fingers and hand, you're strengthening those hand and wrist muscles. Or if you're using your shoulder, you're working on your rotator cuff. So you want to exercise to improve your conditioning. And I'm just going to leave that link in the description, or in the chat, so you guys can have a reference to it. That's the big three. But hopefully that helps you guys understand a little more about the sensitivity discussion. It just influences what muscles are used, and based on that, you can do things to still stay healthy, regardless of what sensitivity you might choose. Yeah. Let's move on now, unless you have anything you want to add, Kate, to the second question.
No, you hit on it.
Okay. So the second question was from...
I'm super excited for this one.
Yeah, I think it was from...
Because this is a really interesting question to consider, and there's some really good research to talk about. So the question was, do you recommend any supplements to help speed up the recovery of tendons? Example, one-a-day vitamins, protein shakes, things like that. So I'm going to start off this section by saying there is absolutely no nutrition that will make up for a lack of good physical treatment for your tendons. We used to go by the RICE method, right? Rest, ice, compression, elevation. That's the one everybody knows. More recently, though, really within the last 5 to 10 years, there's been this shift in what we know from research and what we know from experience. And we've now shifted to an acronym we call MEAT instead, which is movement, exercise, activity, and treatment. So yes, absolutely still treating things appropriately, progressing things appropriately. But the thing we know about tendons is they don't heal unless they get progressively loaded. So we need to make sure that you're putting the appropriate amount of load on a tendon at the time, at the appropriate time, in order to progressively build that tendon up. Otherwise, that tendon is going to degenerate or not fully heal. So it's really important to keep in mind that all of this nutritional stuff only works if it's also coupled with exercise, and exercise and treatment is the way more important part of the equation. Mm-hmm. That being said, there are some things that we absolutely know do not have a clear benefit specifically relating to improving tendon injury recovery. Things like iron, amino acids, omega-3s, these are generally good things for you. You should not avoid eating them. They will not slow down your recovery. It's just that the research doesn't show that they make any significant impact on your recovery. There is also some research that looks at what the impact of a higher glucose diet does.
That was interesting.
Yeah, the research suggests that a high glucose diet is increased actually or rather the thickness and stiffness was increased in a high glucose population, which also makes sense because cells use sugar as a base. So this isn't saying you should absolutely go out and eat all the candy in the world. It is saying that you need to make sure whatever diet you're eating has an adequate amount of sugars, of carbohydrates, to help fuel that recovery. But of course, tendons are 85% collagen. So collagen, being a protein, is something that you build up by making sure you do supply the appropriate amounts of building blocks of amino acids. And that's not saying you have to go out and eat extra amino acids or that amino acids are going to speed up recovery, but that you need an appropriate and adequate amount of that in your diet. So even if you're vegan or vegetarian, there's plenty of options for making sure you get an adequate protein supply. So things like soybeans, avocado, asparagus, cottage cheese is actually dairy, isn't it? If you're vegan, avocado, asparagus are good options. Lentils, almonds. If you're pescatarian, adding in fish like tuna and cod. And then if you are good with eating the whole spectrum, like I am, chicken, cheese, eggs are all good sources of protein. Make sure you're focusing on lean whole proteins. So getting a mix of plant and animal protein sources. But again, this is just to have that adequate baseline for recovery, not saying it's going to significantly boost your tendon healing. There is some research that suggests vitamin C, vitamin A, and selenium can help with wound healing, partly because vitamin C in particular is an antioxidant. So it helps to neutralize the effect of reactive oxidative species, which can cause tissue damage. But again, it's important to note that for the most part, there's not something that you can take that's going to significantly boost your recovery. There is a small amount of anecdotal evidence that suggests eating gelatin and vitamin C, like a capsule, about 30 to 60 minutes before exercise may promote greater collagen production, but it's not supported fully in research yet. It's more of an anecdotal single case study kind of thing. Other than that, really just making sure you're getting the adequate amount of protein every meal, that you're balancing and making sure there's an appropriate amount of glucose, of carbohydrates being included, because you need that raw fuel. And then also keeping in mind, and this was really important, Matt, this was something that you were hitting on, that I definitely want you to expand on, is that the state of the tissue doesn't necessarily reflect how much or how well it can function. Do you want to get into that a little bit more? Because you were super excited about this.
Yeah. Basically just that we need to realize that regardless of what we're feeling at the time, the state of our tissues doesn't, or what we're feeling doesn't necessarily reflect the state of our tissue. So we have actually this big focus all the time on how's our tissue doing, how well is it healed. We go to the doctor and we ask for maybe imaging, x-ray, MRI, CT scan to identify, hey, what's going on with our tissue, to see if it's making progress or not. And again, there's more and more research showing things like, hey, even with a hamstring tear, or even with or specifically with a hamstring tear, you don't need to show that the tear is completely recovered before you return to play the sport, which is insane to think about, right? Like, whoa, the muscle fibers, there's still a little scar tissue there, or still some partial tears showing on the MRI. But if we realize that our body is so adaptive, it has such a capacity to adapt to different stressors and even compensate by addressing or shifting some of the motor drivers, shifting some of the load towards the remaining fibers, and those being strong enough to handle the stress of whatever sport you're playing. In the same way, we have to realize that, hey, while we might be looking to eat things, to take a bunch of vitamin C, vitamin A, or selenium to heal our tendons a little more, it might not even really make a difference to what you might be able to do in terms of gaming, right? Because again, if your tendon is all of a sudden fully, if the tendon tissue is 100% in terms of fully healed versus partial degeneration, it doesn't necessarily mean that those two are different in function. It might just mean that, hey, well, there's a little more collagen here, and that's it. Just that there's more collagen here now.
And it makes no difference.
Exactly. It makes no difference functionally, which is why I think the most important thing for us as healthcare practitioners is to actually help you guys focus a little more on function than it is to focus on pain or, hey, how's my tissue doing?
And
hey,
look,
how's my blood values?
It's definitely important to address things like pain. People need to know about it. But there's been a push in PT, and I think it's a really good push to talk not just about pain, but about function. Because there's two ways that we can measure progress, right? We can look at, is your pain improving, and is your function improving? So if, for example, you've got a 5 out of 10 pain in your wrist that occurs no matter what all the time, and you can't do anything because it hurts too much, and then as we start to work on exercises, you get to the point where you're able to, play for half an hour. Your pain will still be 5 out of 10 afterwards, but you could do that half an hour without your pain getting any worse. That's also progress. Your pain didn't change, but your function did. So making sure that we're not just hyper-focusing on pain, which is an important part, but it's not the only part. You're here because you want to do better, not just feel better. It's both of those things. So if we leave out the function part of things, then we are leaving out the really big piece. One other thing that I did want to note with tendon injury recovery is just that kind of like in the early aftermath of a tendon injury being like mostly / fully healed, you lose a little bit of compliance at the end where it attaches to the muscle. So at that point, the muscle is actually a little bit more susceptible to injury. So making sure that you're paying attention to progressive loading all the time, not just when you're recovering from injury. That's part of why it's so important to pay attention to your training loads. There's a lot of reasons it's important, but especially when it comes to avoiding future injuries, recognizing what your training load is at and making sure that it's appropriate for the amount of strength and endurance that your tissue currently has, and then building that up slowly over time.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That really just encapsulates how we need to really approach many, if not all, gaming injuries, right? Like we just need to understand what we're doing to load our tissues and how we can ensure that we're doing enough wrist curls or exercises to strengthen the muscles and tendons of our wrist and hand or our forearms to allow us to handle that. And it sounds really simple, but again, we understand it's not easy to implement into our lifestyles, which is why,
right.
That's the goal, right? That's what we're trying to help you guys achieve. So I think there's a lot more to go into that, but let's get to the third question, which will have more or less of a shorter answer because it is somewhat addressed in the first question that was asked. So in this third question, what was asked was, what are your thoughts on mouse spines for building and building specific to Fortnite? Is it bad for your hands, and is it better to have binds on your keyboard instead? So this is actually something I created a full video about, specifically identifying what are the top players using for the keybinds and what does it mean for the actual physical stress on her wrists, hands, fingers. And I just want to give you guys this example to help you guys better understand what it might mean and what it might look like, and it will help you understand the question or understand the answer to the question. So let's say we have player 1 who has his ramp, cone, wall, and floor, the 4 builds in Fortnite, bound to his index finger. And Bugha, from what I remember, did exactly that. He has everything bound close by to his left hand, but he presses them all with his index finger. Player 2 has his ramp and cone bound to his thumb muscles, thumb binds on the mouse 4 and mouse 5, and then he has his wall and floor to his pinky and index finger. Let's make it really simple here. If both players played in the same game and there was 1,000 of each build in the 30-minute game, that means that the index finger for player 1 will have moved 4,000 times, right? Whereas on the player 2, the index finger will only be moving 1,000 times, and the pinky finger also moves 1,000 times, but the thumb will be moving 2,000 times. And that, of course, is not the distribution of how builds are occurring in Fortnite, but I'm just demonstrating the example of
better.
Yeah, we're just demonstrating the example of, hey, what you are doing with your fingers and what you're binding, what keys that you're using, definitely have an influence in what muscles are being used. And again, just like the first question, whatever muscles you use, that will definitely increase the risk that you might develop some overload or some tissue irritation or some tendon irritation. So I would say I think it's fine actually to use any distribution of keybinds as long as you're mindful of what you're using on a regular basis. And then again, doing the big 3, making sure you have the appropriate thumb conditioning if you do have mouse 4, mouse 5, that you perform on a regular basis to handle that stress. Oh, I stretch after every game for my thumb. Oh, I do these thumb exercises every morning. I also use resistance. I have a little stress ball. if you do that, then it doesn't matter, right? Because you have so much endurance that you can maybe handle 10,000 actions over the course of the day, right? And again, I'm making it more simple for you guys to understand, but that's the approach that I want you guys to take when it comes to doing the things that will help you have a longer gaming career or help you minimize the risk of injury. So just as a review, the big three are, again, you want to look at your posture and your ergonomics so that per action, the load for your muscles and tendons aren't higher than they need to be. We need to make sure you guys are scheduling well, having the appropriate breaks, and then conditioning your thumb, conditioning your fingers, your forearm, your shoulder, whatever you're using, your eyeballs, so that you can handle however long you're playing for X amount of days or, I don't know, years in a row, right? Because like me, I'm a little older, but I still game. So I am actually going to be going climbing after this, so I'm going to be conditioning my forearms. But yeah, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Nope. That was actually a question from somebody that I've worked with in our gaming health coaching program. And it was such a good question. I was like, you should ask this one in the chat because like people are going to want to learn about this. Exactly. And yeah, it's about that distribution of forces of activities over time, because it's a lot easier to condition your whole hand for, you know, a moderate amount of activity than like 2 fingers for an extreme amount of activity.
Exactly.
There's not one right set of keybinds for everybody, but keeping in mind, you know, what are the loads that I'm going to be placing on these different tissues? Can I adequately train them to support those loads? You'll be able to figure out binds that both work for you and are safe for your tissues.
And, you know, if in the future there's a way that we can get access to Fortnite's data and letting us know how many builds go on per game on average, then somehow we might be able to draw better correlations as to what might be at risk.
We could totally write a research paper about this.
I wonder, Epic, if you're listening.
Epic, reach out to us. We got.
Same thing with any other game. You know, there's a lot of things that we can draw better conclusions about in terms of physical stress if we understand some of the data underlying it. And hey, maybe in the game we might be able to have some better recommendations. Instead of Fortnite dances, you have an emote that has you doing a stretch. Ooh, Epic, hit me up, hit us up. You know, we have these.